Hi everyone, my name is Azuree Holloway and I'm a freelance photographer based in Chicago. I live here in the Midwest with my husband Trevor and our dog son Pigeon. I've been photographing professionally, freelance for 10 years, this year actually. So it's my full-time job. I enjoy doing it. I actually photograph a variety of things. I love to shoot live music. I love to shoot events. I love to shoot cocktails and style them. And I'm new to shooting fitness and wellness spaces, which has been really fun for me. I also shoot for Quiltfolk magazine, which is something that Trevor and I do together. We get to travel around the country and meet amazing quilters, quilt historians, quilt collectors. And so I have the privilege and honor to photograph and document these, which is really fun and something that I look forward to every time the trip's around the corner. Trevor and I run an art collective here in Chicago called Inside Town, where we both have art practicing spaces. I have a photo studio, and then we also have a variety of artists who practice out of there as well. We really love to throw events there. I have several sewing machines there, so when I'm finally ready to begin my quilting journey, I have space for it and some tools in my bag already. I also really enjoy to shoot Polaroids. That's something that I do for fun, just kind of for myself, my own personal photography practice. And I love hiking and hanging out with Trevor and Pigeon. We love to go on adventures together. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell, I think. My favorite approach to lighting is to use natural available light when possible. I think it's the most flattering. I think it allows you to get true colors and kind of to see everything well and organically. So my goal is always to try to use natural available light. If not, I have a few tips and tricks for shooting indoors and still using available light, but also some tips for when you have to use some artificial lighting. So thank you for being here and joining me. If you have any questions after watching this video, we're going to do a live Q&A. Our date and time will be listed on the website. So please check in and make notes of questions you may have for me. I'm happy to answer to my best knowledge. I love photography. I feel very lucky to be a photographer, and I'm always happy to share whatever knowledge I have. So let's jump in. I love to shoot outdoors when possible. I feel like natural light is just the most flattering. I think you're gonna have better colors in your pictures. Plus, it's kind of fun just to get outside. There's less challenges in shooting indoors. So I try to get outside when I can for shoots. The number one thing is you want to avoid high noon, unless it's overcast, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when the sun is high up in the sky, it's creating the harshest shadows, and that's going to create shadows. Like if you have one little crease in your quilt, you're going to see that. So you want to try to avoid high noon. It's just literally the worst time of day to ever shoot portraits, because the sun is right here. It's creating all these shadows down on your face. It creates shadows on everything. So it's fun if you're trying to be dramatic. It's hard to get an evenly lit photo. So you should try to, if you're a morning person, get up, I would say, depending on the time of year, let's assume that it's light outside around 6 a.m., like 6 to 10 a.m. are good times to shoot. After the sun's come up and it's like a little high in the sky, it's not quite so dawny looking, but before it's really high up, that's a great time of day to shoot. It's also a really great time of day to shoot a little bit before sunset. I would say like an hour before sunset. The sun is pretty low in the sky, so you're getting more even overall lighting, no harsh shadows. That's a beautiful time of day to get outside and shoot. When you are shooting outside, the very best case scenario actually is an overcast day. Do not be afraid of overcast weather. When there is sunshine, but there's clouds over it, above the sun, that's when you're getting studio-like quality lighting. So in the studio, you always kind of have like a diffuser, like think of if you've seen studio photography and umbrella, that's to make the light a little softer and to distribute it better. And the clouds naturally do that with sunlight. So as long as it's not gloomy looking, like if you could tell it's like impending doom, that's not a great time of day to shoot because it will look gloomy. But if it's just a little cloudy, slightly overcast, or you have big poofy clouds kind of coming in and giving you coverage from time to time, that's a great time of day to shoot. This is what we look for rather when we're on the Quiltfolk trips. tips when we're shooting outside. We wait for a cloud if it's too sunny, or if we're lucky, usually during kind of like winter times, it's usually like a little bit slightly overcast, and that's really honestly the best lighting situation for outside. All right, so when you're shooting outside, let's say it's a little bright, that's not a big deal. We can find some shade. Shade is always what I look for when I'm shooting outside in a bright sunny day. This could be shade, it could be under a tree. That's pretty, depending on where you are, pretty easy to find. You just want to look for some even shade. So you can just look at the ground, what's being cast down. So if you're shooting by trees, just try to find an area that has even lighting that you can either hold your quilt up or put it on a stand. If you're gonna put it over a branch, you want to look for some beautiful even lighting. And I'll show you some examples here of some dappled light. Dappled light can look cool sometimes. I think it's definitely like a stylistic choice to have a little bit of light kind of coming through something, and it's kind of it's creating a shadow of something on your quilt. Sometimes that's kind of fun. It makes it look a little less flat. It gives it a little dimension, maybe like in a corner, and I'll show you some pictures where you could see that. You definitely want to avoid overall dappled lighting though, because that'll make it really hard to see what you're looking at. So I think a little bit of shadow play is fun, depending on what you're going for. If you're kind of trying to do a styled photo, this could be really cool. It could be like a fun element, lets you know you're outside and that you're playing with the light a little bit. But I would say overall, if you're looking for like a shot of your quilt to submit to a show where you really need to see the work perfectly, you want as much full coverage in shade as you can get to get all those details in and avoid shadows and avoid anything kind of casting on your quilt that might be distracting instead of being an element of intentional lighting. All right, if you're shooting outside and it's just like a really sunny day, and these are the options you have, you don't need to panic. We can just find a little bit of shade. I'll show you this picture here of Lynn on the tobacco farm. Our location was outdoors and it was super sunny, like a very sunny day. And you can actually see that in this picture I'm showing you here. You could see that that tin roof is just reflecting a bunch of light, and it's really bright behind it. Like you could see these leaves over here on the top right corner, they're very bright. It was really sunny, but the roof was creating this perfect amount of shade that we needed to get a portrait of Lynn and this quilt. You can even see if you look kind of down towards the bottom where her feet would be, it's really bright right there. It was very sunny, but we made this picture work because we found a little bit of shade underneath the structure here. So just find a bit of shade. I'll show you some examples. You don't need a bunch. It just needs to be a little bit. It could be, let's see, it could just be the Black Hills Quilt Guild here, these three ladies. You could see it's pretty bright in the back there towards the top right hand corner. I just had them come into a little bit of shade that was provided by trees that weren't casting big shadows. You could see on the ground behind the woman on the right hand corner, it's a lot of shade, and it's really even shade too. So even though it was a bright sunny day, just look for this structure was providing the shade along with some trees that we could just plop some people in, get a perfectly evenly lit photo. So look for shade, look for even shading. Structures will provide this. You can even go, here's another picture from the tobacco farm. You could see on the left hand side of this photo, it was just really bright out there. Really bright. So we found this little door and we were able to style a quilt on there, and it was nice even lighting. There's no dappling happening here. There's nothing creating a cast. It was really good lighting underneath here. So we were able to make it work by just finding some cute shady moments. Here's another picture of Liz Porter's property, which was really pretty. You can see that the lighting behind this tree, it's what I would call blown out. There's a lot of sunlight happening there. So we had to find moments of shade in her yard to style a quilt on. Trevor, my husband, did the styling for this, and he'll talk to you about putting something in the foreground or not if you watch his video. But we use this cactus here to kind of bring your eye to the quilt, and we also brought this wheel over from another part of your yard to put it in some shade that was provided by the trees that was really even. You can see on the bottom, like middle to left corner, the rocks right there, they're getting a little bit bright, like they're a little blown out, and that's because they weren't in the shade. So we found this moment that we were able to create to get a really good styled photo of the quilt. Let's see what else I got in here. When we were at Gertrude Smith Johnson's home, it was pretty bright out that day as well. She had this gorgeous cabinet outside on her porch, and the whole porch was in shade, so it worked out really well for us. So we were able to style this in shade. Look at that perfect lighting on the quilt. There's no shadows, there's no dappling. These are just a few examples of finding shade when it's really sunny outside. All right, as we saw when we were looking at photos in shade, you can see that some of the sun behind the photo was pretty bright. That's called being backlit, and that is when the sun is usually behind what you're shooting. What happens is if you're using a camera, like if you're using your phone, it'll have a hard time kind of like figuring out like what's the proper exposure for this thing. Is it the thing in the front, or is it the bright light in the back? The bright light in the back will usually make your camera, if it's on an auto setting, kind of get darker to make sure that the background isn't completely blown out. So if your quilt is in front of that, then you may lose it. It may be too dark when your camera's auto adjusting for that. So try to avoid backlit scenarios. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's just like what you got, the right fence is there and the sun's in the background, and you may have to just take care of that in post-production, or use the settings on your camera to make sure that you're getting the correct exposure for your quilt instead of the sun that's behind it. Here's one example of this. We had access to this awesome bridge. You could see that there are ducks on the bottom right corner. They're blown out because the sun was back there, but the quilt is perfectly exposed. I exposed for the quilt, so I knew I would be losing some of the detail and imagery in the background. This is totally fine. It's not it's not frowned down upon to do, but I know that when you're using your phone, it might give you a little bit of a hard time finding that light. Here's an example at Mary Fitzgerald's house. She had just this super cute little shed. It was a perfect moment to style this quilt. It was also backlit though, and that's okay. We exposed for the shed that the quilt is on for the door there, and you can see that you're losing detail in those trees behind it. I'm totally fine with that because the photo is so fun and magical. I think if you had a quilt just on a quilt stand, like in a field, and it's backlit, that might not look so good. That might just it might kind of fall flat a little bit. So, but we have so many good things our eyes are drawn to that we're not really focused on how bright it was behind the subject. We're looking at the quilt itself. We're looking at all the little magical details in this photo. I'm pretty sure a fairy and gnome live here. So that's what your eye's drawn to. So again, backlighting is not the worst thing, but if you can, you want to try to take a picture where the sun is behind you. Here's a portrait I took where we were looking for some shade. There wasn't a lot of options, so it had to be a little backlit, but it looks great. She looks great. It would have been nice to see the mural behind her a little bit more because the mural did have quilts on it. We got another picture. We reconfigured and got a picture that included that because we got some cloud coverage that allowed us to take that picture. But in this moment, while we were doing these portraits, this was kind of the best I could get. So this is just to show you what backlighting is. And I'm pretty sure this was taken in the high noon scenario of that worst case, very bright lighting where you're looking for shade. Sometimes it's going to have to be backlit. I think if you have the option to shoot during a different time of day when the sun's a little lower, that's always best. But if you're in a jam or you're in a situation where you need to take it around noon and that's what you got, it's totally fine. And I'll help you figure out how to fine tune your phone to be able to compensate for that bright light in the back, but still have your quilt in the front in focus. And we'll cover that in a second. One of the easiest places to find shade is going to be below trees. It's beautiful. I love to shoot in nature when I can. It's fun to style a quilt on a branch or near a tree or have someone holding one in the woods. I think that's so beautiful. It's like sometimes a great juxtaposition of what the quilt looks like in nature. It could really draw your eye to the quilt. I would stay away from shooting maybe quilts that incorporate a lot of nature or maybe too green. They may get lost in a lot of trees or leaves situations, so maybe stay away from that. But bright colors really pop well in trees. And one thing to be careful of though, if it's really sunny, and again, like I really have it out for high noon light, but with the sun's coming straight down or even just hitting at the right angle through the leaves will become kind of translucent, right? And they'll cast a green shadow on your quilts. Just be aware of that. You'll see it in your camera if it's looking a little green, and you can use software to take the green out a little bit. I've had to do that. I'm going to show you one quilt here where I was kind of shooting through these leaves. You can see I took some of the green out, but you can kind of still see it there. You know, those whites aren't quite super white. I thought this was a fun and fine thing. I mean, you could tell it's still white, but if you're really being critical, it reads a little bit green. So it's just something to be aware of when you're shooting through a lot. It's usually a lot. Like if you're just shooting through one tree, it's usually like if you're in the thick of the woods, and all the lighting that's coming through is coming through leaves and greenery, it tends to cast a little bit of a green hue or tint onto your quilt. Here's another picture to illustrate that. You could see if you're looking at her left-hand side here, you can see her skin tone's reading a little green, just a little bit. It's not really enough. Like her hair is still nice and white. Her quilt looks really good, but you're getting a little bit of that cast. This picture also has backlighting, which we talked about. The sun is right behind her, so we found the shade here in these steps, but the greenery was beautiful. We really want to incorporate it. She has trees, barren trees on her quilt, so we thought it would be really fun to have some leaves in there. If this has been any greener, it wouldn't have worked for me. So it's just something to be aware of. When you're shooting near greenery, you might get a cast and you want to avoid that. And you can always find a spot that will just kind of move around to a place that maybe has a little bit less leaves, but still shade being cast from a tree trunk or something or a structure nearby. So don't be disappointed. It's always a shift. It's always kind of moving around, finding the right spot and making it work. You have to be a little bit tenacious sometimes, but there's usually a good spot nearby. We've never had to go super far in or out of woods or a shady location to find a spot that works. Although shooting outdoors is my favorite thing, sometimes you have to shoot inside or you want to shoot inside. And there are definitely lots of ways to shoot inside and get naturally lit, beautiful photos of your quilts. Best practices are to open up your shades, open your windows, let as much light into the room you decide you want to shoot in as possible. And there's a few things maybe to go over before that. Shooting indoors can be tricky because there can be maybe a lot of stuff in a room, or maybe you don't feel like you have the right photogenic corner. Do not let that deter you. You just need one corner. I mean, I'll show you some photos by windows that were just little tiny corners that worked really, really well for taking photos of portraits and of styled quilts. Just find a little nook. And then I usually tend to just gravitate towards the windows. Like, where's the window in the house or studio? Okay, what's something close by that I could use this natural available light to shoot my quilt in? Sometimes it's bringing a chair over close to the window light. Sometimes it's just draping a quilt on a table, like on your sewing table. If you can bring your sewing table close to the window, you can get a good naturally lit photo that way. And before you do all this work, you'll want to make note of the time of day in the room you want to shoot in that has the best natural light. So that just depends on, where your windows are facing west or east, where the sun is. But just take note, maybe the day before you decide to shoot, make note of, find your location you want to shoot in your house or in your studio, and make note of when there's the best light. And the best light is going to be the most even light. So if you have plants or something in there, make sure it's not too harsh shadows, just like nice, even lighting coming into your home. Make note of that and then set up your shoot for that time of day whenever you're ready to photograph. Again, you'll want to open up if you tend to have your shutters closed or you have like a especially darker draped curtain, open those up. You'd be surprised how much wonderful, beautiful natural light will come in, and it makes such a difference in a really good indoor photo. So don't be afraid to kind of move objects that might be near your window, maybe obstructing your window view, to let in some of that natural light and to make best use of it for your indoor shoot. Okay, one tip for shooting inside that may seem counterintuitive is to turn off lamps and overhead lights. If you're getting really good natural light in the location that you're trying to shoot indoors, the lamp lighting, whether it's installed like recessed in above head, or if it's like a lamp on a nearby table, will usually create an orange cast of lighting that's going to look bad on your quilt. It'll basically, yeah, it's going to be creating like an orange hue on your quilt. You don't want that. It could also be creating, if it's an overhead light, it could be creating like a spotlight down on your quilt, or the lighting might pick up differently and strangely through your camera, through your phone. So when you can, turn off overhead lights or nearby lamps and just point your phone at the quilt near the window lighting, and it will usually compensate. It'll usually try to figure out like, oh no, it got dark in here. Let me, do my like wizardry in camera, and it will make a good exposure for you. And if that doesn't happen, you can always, on my camera, you can put your finger in the middle. It's kind of a little known fact that I found out just a few years ago. You can put your phone, if you have an iPhone, you can put your finger on the screen and hold it there for a second, and you'll get a little box that has a sun beside it, and you can turn the sun up or down. So that's exposure. So you're getting a brighter exposure or a darker exposure. Let's say you're by a lot of window lighting and it's a little too bright. Your camera should auto compensate for that. But if it's especially a light colored quilt and you're not quite getting the colors you want, you can hold your finger down on the screen and then bring the little sundial down. There's probably something similar if you use like a Galaxy or another kind of phone. There's almost always an exposure compensation button. So try to find that, and yeah, you can adjust the exposure up or down to allow a little more light in or a little less light in. And if you find that you're using your natural light and let's say it's a little too bright, like you have too much good light, that's when you'll want to diffuse the light a little bit. So that's when you'll want to put a curtain over your window, something sheer, something translucent. That's just going to make the sun quality a little less harsh, but still allow light in. And I mentioned this earlier, but that's like what you use in studio lighting. You'll put a umbrella or a softbox over your light so that it's, for one, it's distributing the light more evenly, and it's also just diffusing the light. So it's not so harsh. It's not making like a targeted kind of spotlight on the thing you're photographing, but instead it's kind of distributing that light a little bit more evenly and a little less harsh lighting. So that's an easy fix. With it could be a white sheet over your window. It could be, you'll want to avoid something too dark because then you're just cutting off all the light, but just diffuse the light a little tiny bit, and that should help you out. When you're shooting indoors, you'll want to try to shoot in front of the window if possible. Let's say you only have one window. If you're shooting something on the side of the window, then it may not be distributed evenly. The easiest thing to do is to set something up right in front of your window and photograph it that way. You'll get the most even lighting. You're not going to get any sideways shadows from the sun kind of coming in and hitting it at the side. It's just going to head it straight forward. That's the best case scenario. If you're shooting, and remember we talked about backlit, you can use a natural available light and kind of blow out and everything behind you where the light source is coming from. That's totally fine. Here's a picture I took that way. We were in a room that had a lot of good available light, but her sewing station was set up with her back to the window. So this worked out fine. I still was able to photograph her. You can see a little bit of that window lighting. It's kind of making everything in the background here on the left kind of left middle part of the photo, it's making all of that a little bit blown out, but that's totally fine. Her face is exposed well. We can see her machine. So if you get really good natural light, this is a good, you can still do this, but the best practice is going to be getting right in front of the window. So do you see this photo compared to the last photo? We had Rowan sit right in front of her window. She happened to have a couch in her studio here, so it was perfect. Totally even lighting on her face. Her quilt is nice and well lit. You're not seeing a bunch of shadows anywhere. This was a best case scenario. This was great. All right, so when you're using natural available light, you'll want to I always try to start taking the picture from the source of light. So stand near the window. You can see in this picture right here, you can see that the light is coming from you really see it well on the right side of the photo. You're just going to get the most kind of light from here, and your camera won't be competing with trying to compensate like I was talking about earlier with backlighting. So a lot of times shooting from the window is kind of the best situation. You're going to get really great light this way. And again, if it's too bright, you can always pull a sheer curtain over, put a white sheet over your window, or partially bring down the shade a little bit. That can sometimes help. You don't want to ever shoot through shades. A lot of times those create lines and shadows on your quilts, or on if you're trying to photograph yourself with your quilt, it'll create lines. So you'll want to just like shimmy those up. And I know it's scary. Like I feel like I'm always going to break my shades whenever I'm doing that, or someone else's shades, but that's kind of a best practice. Yeah, just try to, if you can, shoot from the direction the light's coming in. Start there at least. Move around the room too. Don't be afraid to just get stuck to one thing. I think the fun part of photography is just seeing what works and experimenting a little bit. It could also be frustrating, but hopefully these practices will help you figure out the best place to start and kind of give you a base of knowledge where you can be confident in saying like, okay, cool, I'm going to open up my windows. I'm going to let that sunlight in, and then I'll kind of tweak from there. So start from the window at your back, taking a picture in the direction of the light. If that's not working, definitely move around. Try different angles with your phone too. You can sometimes find a cool angle that works better. Like if it's a little backlit, like if you're taking a picture of a quilt on a bed and it's backlighting a little bit, if you just come up a little bit, sometimes the camera won't see the window, so it won't be trying to compensate for that. So that could be like a fun little easy hack. I like to shoot pretty square. Like I like to shoot a lot of straight on things, sometimes at an angle too, but I always am very inspired by Wes Anderson's kind of viewpoint of everything just being kind of like a little straightforward. I love symmetry, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And I found myself being really surprised at shooting from a different angle and how the light may look different. For instance, if the light's coming in a little high up from your window instead of straight through, that can create different kinds of lighting. So just kind of experiment a little bit. Don't be afraid to go a little low, maybe come up a little high instead of always having the camera right in front of you. So we're going to take a peek at this video here that I took a little earlier where I put a quilt down on our couch. It's actually still right here behind me. And then you see there's a little bit of shadow. And let's say I'm really trying to show the details of this quilt and I don't want the shadow, but I like the way it's styled, right? So you can use this foam board and you can see right here without the foam board, it's a little darker. I just literally slid the foam board right in front there, and it started to reflect light from the window onto the shadow pieces. One really simple tool I carry with me everywhere I go on my shoots is a reflector. You can find these online. The reflector I have is a 5-in-1, so it has a black side, which will dampen light. If it's too bright, you can use the black side. It'll kind of absorb light. The white side reflects light. It also has a silver side and a gold side. These are usually used more for portraits for skin tones, and then a translucent side. So you could take off the whole thing, and I'll try to link this if I can below. If that is inaccessible to you, or if you feel like that's a little bit too much, like you probably won't use that often, the white foam, $1 or $2, just as handy, honestly, especially for shooting quilts. It it just reflects the light. So you can, let me see, or anything white. You could use a white sheet too. That won't be as effective. I feel like you want something hard that's going to reflect the light, but anything white will help. Sometimes it's helped to close a door, a white door in a room when we've been trying to photograph something on a wall and we need a little bit of fill light. I've closed a door and the light coming, through the window, hitting the white door is bouncing back off and giving that fill light. That's really nice. That's an easy, cheap fix for shooting, losing shadows, and making sure things are evenly lit. So I'll even show you, where's my board? I'll be right back. Okay, so here's my whiteboard. It's just, normal stuff, foam board. I got this at the dollar store. You can see it's kind of dinged up, doesn't matter. So here, I'll show you right now, just using my face right here in the video. You could see there's a little bit of, it's a little darker here on this side than it is on this side, right? My window's right here. So I'm just gonna hold the foam board up and you could see already so this is without the foam board. This is with the foam board. I'm literally just holding it up and it's about a foot from my face. So it doesn't even have to be close. It's just, you could see, and if I move it around a little, I'm moving it in front of me, to the side, it's shaping the light a little bit. You see back here, we kind of lose the effect. It's back here. And then when I bring it in front of me, because the window's literally right in front of the foam board, it's filling this in. It's more evenly lit. So without it, with it, it works the same with your quilts. So that's a cheapy little trick that can really help you. If you're creating silhouettes, if you're trying to do a cute moment of your, a square on your table or something, and you're using window light, but it's kind of falling off a little bit on one corner, you could use a piece of white paper, just put it off camera, make sure it's in line, and you just kind of move it around until it's hitting the window light. See, you could see it kind of working on my face here. However I move the foam board will reflect the light differently and more or less light too. So play around with that. That's one of my favorite hacks and an easy way to continue to use window lighting. All right, and I want to go over a few tips for using your phone. Like I said earlier, phones are just so powerful and truly incredible right now. Sometimes I get a little scared as a photographer, I don't know, the in-camera things that are happening on our phones are so good. I feel like I may be out of my job one day. But for right now, let's just harness that power that our phones have, right? Portrait mode, if your phone has that, is a really great tool. So without getting too much into photography terms, because that could be really boring, well, not for a nerd like me, but if you're not trying to be a full-time photography hobbyist, you just want to know how to photograph your quilts, maybe yourself with your quilts. Portrait mode, if your phone has something like that, is great. So what that does is it will figure out what you're photographing. So if it's your face, if it's a thing, like a quilt, it will figure it out, and you can kind of see it starts to put these little lines kind of around the item, and it'll make the background blurry. This is a really easy way. The blurriness is called depth of field, so it's kind of faking a depth of field. So that really makes it so that your eye is drawn to the subject matter. So if there's stuff happening behind the quilt, especially let's say you're photographing this in your studio and it's kind of busy in there, there's a lot of things going on, and maybe you have a colorful quilt. Well, when you take a picture, the quilt may not be the first thing you look at, right? You might be looking at that vintage singer in the background, or your beautiful rainbow colored spools of thread. So you want the quilt to be the focus. So one thing you could do is use portrait mode, which will put a haze. It'll kind of make it a little blurry, the background, and just everything in focus is the thing, the subject. So your quilt in this scenario. If you have that, definitely use it. Here, I'm going to restart this video and show you. I have a portrait mode on video and show you what that looks like. So you can see here, I've gotten a little close to the camera because you can see that right behind me, that plant's out of focus. This pillow over here is out of focus. The phone's tracking my face. So if I step back, you can see it's a little more dramatic when I'm up close, but you can kind of see it looks a little fake. So yeah, you can see this hair is out of focus because it's trying to give me that fake depth of field, which I think is really helpful. Instead of, being focused on this pillow behind me right here, I'm perfectly in focus. So that's something that you should use to your advantage. If you have portrait mode, definitely turn that on. And another tip that I kind of just went through was, if you do like the environment you're photographing in really matters too. Like you want when you're taking pictures of your quilts, you want that to be the center of attention. So it's totally fine to use a prop to help kind of style and show off your personality, or maybe give context to the quilt, but you really want it to be kind of like a minimally set up scenario. And this is no diss to maximalist, because I love maximalism too, but you could use things like depth of field. Like, let's say you want a lot of like poppy things happening that have to do with your quilt. When you're using this portrait mode, it'll help kind of still have those things in the background. You're still having a vibe, but the thing that you want to show off is what's in focus. All right, HDR is another topic, right? HDR is a setting on a lot of phone cameras. And what that does is it actually takes several photos at the same time and compiles them into one photo. So without getting too technical, it just kind of makes things look a little fake sometimes. I feel like if you've ever seen a photo, I feel like you see this in sunset photos a lot, where like usually when the sun is setting, whatever's in front of the sun, you can't really see because the camera is focusing on the sun. When you can see those things in front of it in the foreground, it looks a little unnatural. I'll try to find a few. I don't really use HDR, so I don't have these images, but I'll try to find some online to show you that it could look a little fake. I would turn off HDR. I think that you just get it looks more natural in my opinion. Also, when you're using HDR, it's going to sometimes fill in gaps where there should be light, because it's compositing. It's putting together several photos taken with different exposure compensations to get the perfect photo. Sometimes it can make your quilt look a little crispy because it's an unnatural thing. It's using too many files at once. So I would say at least experiment, be aware of HDR. Maybe you like that look. Just know that it exists. It's literally just HDR in your camera settings. Try taking a photo with it on, try taking a photo with it off. You may like that effect. I just wanted you to know what that did. Yeah, I think portrait mode's the way to go, but I think HDR probably does have some benefits, maybe in really, really tough lighting scenarios. Again, experiment with that. I just wanted to bring that to the awareness. One thing that I should have mentioned at the beginning is that you should turn your camera's flash off. The flash is seldomly going to produce a good picture, especially of a quilt, especially when you're trying to use natural light. Your camera should detect that there's enough natural light, you don't need your camera. But if it's questionable, if it's like slightly dark or not quite as much natural light as you'd like is coming in, your camera might detect that and it might try to compensate for that and use flash. If you turn your flash off, most cameras will just automatically become brighter. Phone cameras will automatically become brighter and compensate for that. You may have to hold your phone a little stiller for longer. It may take like a second or, I don't know, just a little bit longer than usual to get that perfect exposure. So just hold it really still, maybe prop your phone up with something. If you're trying to take a picture with the flash off and you find there's a lag and maybe your hands aren't that steady, prop your phone up against a mug, or if you have a tripod, like a camera tripod. These are also sometimes found at like the dollar store or really cheaply on Amazon. That could be really helpful as well. But usually what happens when you do use flash on camera, it casts this light that's actually not enough light to give you to cover the whole quilt. Or like a portrait scenario, it's just really sometimes bright and may make your oil, like your skin, look oily or highlighted. So you want to make sure to turn that off. It also creates a color cast on your quilts that you don't want. You want to represent like the actual fabrics and colors that you chose and used for your quilt. So yeah, turn the flash off. Almost always the camera will know it needs to compensate for light a little bit, and it will do that on its own. All right, if you feel like you got this, like maybe you knew some of these things, maybe you learned a few things, but you're feeling pretty confident about your photography skills and you want to take it to the next level, definitely try to download an editing app on your phone. My favorite one to use is called VSCO, Visco. It has some presets on there that I love to use. It's very easy to find the buttons to make your photo a little lighter, a little darker. It has options to bring up shadows. So if you got a little bit of shadows in your photo that you want to tweak, you can hit the shadows button and bring the shadows up a little bit, which means it makes it a little lighter, so it's less shadows. If you're having highlights, which is kind of a little bit what's happening right here, like it's a little bright right here, right? Like highlights, it's a little white things that are peaking, they're just a little too bright. You can bring highlights down a little bit. These are things to look for in a photo editing software. There's also, auto, like iPhones have an auto correct function that you could mess around with. Definitely take a peek at those settings and kind of play around to edit with your phone photos. I mean, it's literally the software that comes with our phones is so incredible. It's so impressive. We've come so far with digital photography. Take advantage of those. Feel free to kind of play around. It also, cropping is a really powerful tool. If you find that you have like the perfect photo, but like our dog Pigeon is kind of always in the mix, sometimes I need to crop him out a little bit. Or you can use cropping just as a way to draw the eye to something. So let's say you took a great picture of your quilt, but really you have like a really favorite block in there. Or maybe you're talking about a specific fabric in your quilt that you used. You can take the photo you already took, that's awesome, and you can crop in a little bit. So you can, crop it in and then delete out the rest of it and make that piece bigger so that the eye is drawn specifically to that. You can crop out things that you don't like that were in the photo. It's a really powerful tool. Cropping can make or break a photo, honestly. So play around with cropping. That should be in app. That should be native to your phone. Like you should be able to, when you're looking at your photos, swipe up a little bit or hold the photo down and bring it up, and you should get editing options. All right, that's all from me. I hope you found these tips helpful. Again, please just chime in to the website to see when the times for our live Q&A. I would love to answer any questions you have. It could be literally anything from editing to shooting to extra tools, supplemental tools. Lighting is very inexpensive right now. You can get continuous LED lights, and that could be helpful. If you have questions about anything like that, please let me know. I would love to help out in any way I can. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's always been one of my goals to pass on my knowledge about photography. So this has been really special. I love the quilt community so much, and it brings me so much joy to photograph these quilts. And so it's been really fun to try my best to pass on some helpful tips to you. Also, I would love to see any photos you've been taking. After this class, I am Azuree Holloway on Instagram, AZUREEHOLLOWAY. So if you're on there and you post and you found this helpful, I would love to see your work. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see some of you at Q&A.